This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Kraft Mac and Cheese is better than 90s hip hop. We'll remind you of your childhood without making you feel incredibly old. Kraft Mac and Cheese, best thing ever.
Welcome to Japan on Film podcast. I'm your host, Perry Constantine, and today I am joined by a returning guest, and that is Derick McDuff. Derick, how you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Always good to have you on the show, either this one or the sister show, Superhero Cinephiles. Always a good time to chat with you about this stuff. And today we are going to be talking about a very interesting film. We're going to be talking about 2001's Ichi the Killer,殺し屋 Ichi in Japanese, which literally translates to Ichi the Killer, right? In Ichi, of course, being the number one in Japanese. But before we dive too much into the movie, why don't you remind people about who you are and what you do?
So I am the host of the Underrated Movie Podcast, where I discuss films that are underrated, underappreciated, and ones that have gone on the radar. I also host a couple other things, including Infinity Stones and Dragon Bones, a Marvel podcast. But yeah, the big one is underrated.
Okay, great. And as I mentioned, today we are talking about Ichi the Killer, which is directed by Takashi Miike and is based on a manga by Hideo Yamamoto. But I've never actually read the manga, so I'm not really sure how the comparison works. But what is your kind of history with this film or with Miike in general?
Yeah, so this was actually the first time I had ever seen this movie. You have your big list of Japanese films that you want to cover, and I was like, you know what? Of all of them, I had been meaning to see this. I haven't seen this. I haven't seen Audition. So it's kind of a blank spot for me. His film, a lot of his films. The only one of his movies I've seen is his adaptation of Ace Attorney, which I am quite fond of. I think that's a really good video game film that Western audiences haven't really seen. I covered it on Underrated. But yeah, I know that's not really what he's famous for. He's much more famous for these splatterpunk, I guess you'd call them, horror slasher movies. So I really wanted to tick this box off and come in and talk about it with you.
Yes, so I am very familiar with this movie. I've talked about Miike a lot on this show. He's one of the reasons why I got into Japanese cinema in the first place. And it was really with Audition was kind of what started me on this journey that I'm still presently on, over 20 years later. And when I saw Audition the first time, it completely blew my expectations away. It was I loved it. I still love it. I think it might be my favorite of his films, actually, still to this day. And shortly after that, about a year after that or so, I saw Gozu. I had the chance to watch it in the theater, and that was a completely mind-bending experience, which I talked about last season. And then as I continued on, and after Gozu, I really kind of got interested in discovering more about Miike's work, and that led me to Ichi the Killer, which is one of his most famous works. And it and not only did it's not, we're watching it last night. I think my opinion of it has kind of gone down a little bit. It's kind of cooled over the years. Um, but but it's still an interesting movie. And one of the things that it did do as well was it also introduced me to Tadanobu Asano, who plays Kakihara in this. And he ended up becoming, one of my favorite Japanese actors. And after watching him in this, I ended up seeking out some other of his movies, not related to Miike. So I also credit it with that. And also to a lesser extent, Shinya Tsukamoto, who plays Gigi in this. He's also a director in his own right, directed obviously, most famously, Tetsuo the Iron Man, but also a lot of other movies, some of which we've actually talked about on here. And this was actually the first time I got introduced to him as well. And now Omori, who plays Ichi, I believe I've seen him in other stuff as well, but I'm blanking on it now.
Yeah,
Maybe
I
not.
couldn't tell you.
Yeah, but I think I've seen him in something else too, because I think one time my wife had mentioned something about like, oh, that's the guy from Ichi the Killer or something along those
Mhm.
lines. But anyway, so your first time watching it, what expectations did you have going into it? Because this movie is, I don't know if these days as much, but at least back in the early 2000s, this movie was pretty infamous among film fans for the graphic content and all that. But what was your expectation going into it, and how did you feel afterwards?
Yeah, so going into this one, I kind of knew his reputation from both this and Audition of being a pretty brutal director, like, having some pretty intense scenes. And I guess, the version that I saw was one that had a lot of the scenes that were cut restored into it because I know it was heavily censored in a lot of places and a lot of the footage was taken out. So I guess I watched technically the director's cut, which I think is the one that is widely available now. And yeah, so I was expecting it to be just kind of a lot of my friends who are into horror. I know like this movie a lot of, because this movie I think in the same way that a lot of those films from Japan, Hong Kong, Asian cinema was starting to really break through in the early 2000s. I knew that this had that reputation. So going into it, I expected it to be pretty brutal, to pretty violent. What I was not necessarily expecting, I guess, trigger warning, I guess, for people was a lot of the sexual violence that takes place in this. There is, and from my understanding, that's a lot of what was exercised from the cuts. And I will just say that I'm not a prude by any means, and I think that films can explore those themes. I didn't really love the way that it was done here. I kind of it's funny. I watched it last night. I went to a football game with my brother, and we both were hanging out for a little bit afterwards. And he knocked out, and I started putting on, and he would just wake up at certain points and be like, "What is happening? Like, why are this? I just saw somebody's nipples get cut off. Like, what is going on in this movie?" So yeah, I mean, it was it. I was expecting it to be very intense, and it was even more intense than I was expecting.
So, with that intensity, what did you think of it though? Did you enjoy it aside from the graphic rape scenes and all that? What did you think of the overall story?
Honestly, I this one didn't really do it for me. I'm sorry to say that. I mean, there's stuff that I thought was good about it. You mentioned Tabanoso Asano. Probably mispronouncing his name there.
Tadanobu
He's
Asano.
thank you. So yeah, he's an actor that I quite like. Western audiences would probably be most familiar with him as one of Thor's friends who shows up in the first three Thor movies and then just gets quickly stabbed by Hela. But he
Yep,
shows up in
Hogan the
others.
Grim.
Was that? Oh yeah. But he also shows up in Shogun. He shows up in Silence. He's a really great. I think has found a way to be a really good character actor in a lot of American films. I think his performance is really good. But other than that, I just did not find this movie to be enjoyable. I was like hoping it would be like some gritty Scorsese stuff or something like that, but I didn't really care about the plot. I thought it was kind of um, unnecessarily complex. Just felt like an excuse to give you more and more brutal kills. I I really didn't like the main character. There's nobody really to root for, which it can be fine, but the sheer unrelenting brutality and negativity didn't work for me. And also, I some of the effects in this are really dated. There's some good practical effects, but anytime that something has to be a digital effect, like the guy who gets cut in half, or towards the end of the movie, there's like a digital head that's on a big buff body, and it looks like it's really very early. It's like 2000. Like yeah, this movie came out in 2001 and probably didn't have the biggest budget. So not my favorite watch, if I'm being honest.
No, but I think I'm going to, and my, like I said, my opinion has definitely cooled about
Mhm.
this. I first saw it back when I was in my early 20s, and back in those days, I had more of an appetite for some of the more extreme type of cinema. these days my tastes have kind of mellowed on that front. I mean, like you, I'm definitely not a prude in anything, but there's some stuff that watching it now, whereas before I had no problem watching it. Now I found myself cringing at a lot of stuff. Sexual violence in particular, like sexual
Yeah.
violence, especially, in the wake of Me Too and all that kind of stuff. It's become something I've become much more sensitive towards. And but also things like the scene with Kakihara cutting off part of his tongue as recompense, like that too. That was a scene where I just had to look away. I couldn't watch it. Um, but I will defend the movie though, because I think, well, you make some good points about, the characters not really being likable, the story not really providing a whole lot. And I feel like this is one of these movies where Miike isn't really caring much about the characters or the story in here. It's more about the themes he's trying to express. And I'm not going to take full credit for this. I think Tom Mez, who's a journalist, film journalist, he wrote an excellent book about Miike's film called Agitator, which I believe is out of print, unfortunately. But
Mm.
he had some really interesting takes on it, and I wish I still had the book because all I have to go on is the Wikipedia. But I ended up having to part with the book years ago when I was downsizing. Um, one of the things he wrote here, which is quoted in Wikipedia, was it's a paradox, but Ichi the Killer, a film that sets new boundaries in the portrayal of violence and bloodshed, takes a strongly critical stance toward the portrayal and the consumption of the violent image. However, it does so without ever taking a moral stance towards either the portrayal or the consumption, thus circumventing any accusations of hypocrisy on the part of the director. Miike does not moralize or chastise, but provokes the audience into questioning their own attitudes towards viewing images of violence. He steers them into a direction, but leaves it up to them to draw their own conclusion. And I think there's something to that, right? Because one of the
Mm.
things I notice on the different viewings is that there's a there's an interesting way the violence is portrayed in two ways, right? In some cases, it's it's very difficult to watch, right? It's very hard to watch. It's like the tongue cutting scene, like the rape scenes and all that. Those scenes are very hard to watch. And it But on the other hand, it is contrasted with scenes where the violence is so ridiculously over the top that it's like kind of like the Kill Bill type thing, where
Hmm.
it's like a funny kind of violence, right? You're almost laughing at it, right? It's like a cartoon. Um, and I feel like that is all intentional. Like if you kind of clock the scenes of violence, it's almost always there's a scene of like over the top cartoony violence, often with poor effects, like you mentioned, which again is I think partly intentional, right?
Hmm.
I mean, partly it is the limitations of what Miike had access to, the budget, the technology of the time, and all that, especially because Japanese films generally have not as polished special effects, especially when it comes to like CGI and things like that, as American films. But so like the scene when he cuts the guy in half, right? It's
Hmm.
so ridiculous. It looks so cartoony, but it's contrasted right after that with the scene of him, you know, kind of like leering on the woman sailor,
Right.
and then he cuts her throat, and it is kind of like the blood spurter thing, but it lingers on like her beaten face and everything like that while he's like grinning over her and saying like I'll beat you instead. And so it's almost like Miike leads us into a situation where he makes us laugh first at how ridiculous and over the top the violence is, and then next he hits us with something that is much more visceral and much harder to watch, and almost like this is the same thing is kind of what he's saying, right? In both cases you are laughing at this violence, and now I'm kind of punishing you for it. So I want you to think about the fact that why is violence okay here but it's not okay here? Why is it funny in this situation but not in this situation? So I think kind of confronting the audience with that is really kind of an interesting exercise in itself.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. The juxtaposing the very movie violence, the guy being very clearly CG cut in half, and then having a very like realistic, like that you would never see in real life, and then you have like a very real like neck wound where somebody's like spurting blood out. I think that's all really well done, and I think this is a well, kind of the bad effects aside, this is a generally well-made movie. It's just that I couldn't get behind some of the stuff it was doing. Definitely see the intent in a lot of it, and watching this in through a 2026 lens, I wonder if I had seen this, when I was a teenager, if I might have had different opinions. And yeah, I think that is a good point about like he showing you here's these two different kinds of violence. But for me, it still didn't click in. Um, so I mean, it did at times just feel kind of edgelord. You know what I mean? Just like, and that might not be, the film's fault or his fault. It might be like a Fight Club thing where people are misreading it. But I could see a lot of people being like, "This is so badass," and I don't. I don't know how to put it. Just it's a tough hang. It's a tough watch for sure. And it's not a film that I will be revisiting. But sometimes there's movies that are, tough watches that I come away from being like, hey, yeah, that was hard to get through, but I'm glad I watched it. I'm glad I watched, these really horrific scenes because it made me feel something profound. And I don't know that I ever was moved watching this movie.
Yeah, I can understand that. And like I said, I do have trouble watching some of the violence myself. But I mean, because this movie, like you mentioned, there have been many different cuts of this movie. The violence has been censored in many parts of the world, which I think also kind of does a disservice to the movie. And Mez said something very similar too, and it kind of underplays, it kind of downplays, how serious the violence is and the message when it is kind of cut like that. Um, well, what are some things that you wanted to talk about then? What are some things that you wanted to dive in with this?
Well, I did find the some stuff interesting, that they were putting this like masochistic killer and kind of pairing him against this sadistic like mob enforcer. And you're kind of waiting for the two of them to meet at the end because you have this person who takes literal pleasure from hurting others. He's like, it's almost like the logical conclusion of like a character like Dexter. It's like, oh well, he's a bad guy, but he only ever punishes the bad guys, but he gets off doing it. Against, the character who's like he misses his boss because his boss hurt him. He likes to be hurt, and he also likes to inflict hurt on other people, but he feels at his best when he is has pain caused to him, going up against this person who feels at his best when he is causing others the pain. I think that dichotomy is very interesting, and it's reflective of everything else that's happening around these characters and how they're being manipulated and stuff like that. I think that core thing works really well. And obviously we see it pay off, you know, somewhat effectively, I think, at the end. So it's playing with some interesting things. I do appreciate that it is we do have the full vision now, even if it's not something that I like what's been put back in. I think that it is important and it does take away from what the film is trying to say with that. I will pretty much always advocate for the director creative's full vision of a movie. I did a whole panel at Comic-Con called The Value of a Director's Cut where I talked about how important these things are and getting to see, the whole thing they might have because you were going to lose a lot of context without that. And even though those scenes are hard to watch and I don't love the movie, I will always advocate for the full movie to be shown to people.
Yeah. In terms of the characters and their relationships too, there's some interesting stuff happening, and we almost see kind of a reflection of the two sides of it. It's funny, the character's name is Ichi, but they're really like two sides to his character. All
Hmm.
right. So on the one side, there's this violent, sadistic killer who like relishes violence. But on the other side, there's this kind of like innocent, heroic type character,
Hmm.
who's also kind of like uncertain of himself. And like there's lots of scenes of Ichi when he's he's either in like one of two modes. Either he's like very like standoffish, he's very kind of like shy and um or like almost like depressed. Like the scene
Hmm.
when Gigi comes in and sees him playing the video game, but he's not actually playing it. He's just holding the controller and he's just like holding his head down. And I think those two facets of his character and just like that dichotomy of him, how he either is completely on, he's completely in this violent mode, or else he is just this kind of like sad sack. I thought that was interesting and how that is kind of reflected in the two main Yakuza guys we focus on. We have Kakihara, who is, this like extreme, sadistic, sadomasochist,
Hmm.
sadomasochistic, because he loves causing violence, but he also likes violence visited upon him as well, which is shown with all the piercings he has, the scars on his face, his whole pursuit of, trying to find Anjo the whole time. Because and even when he has Karen try and beat him up, and he's like, this is not the same. This is not doing it for me. Um, all the way to the end where he gets like almost excited at the prospect of confronting Ichi. So there's that aspect of Ichi that is reflected. And then in Kaneko, who is the more heroic character, who you know, but he's also kind of like a sad sack, right? He was a former cop who got fired because he lost his gun. You know, we see in a flashback he's getting beat up over debts, which is how he got introduced to the Yakuza in the first place. Um, but he's also got a good side to him, right? He's trying to be a good father to his son, even after his wife ran out on him. So it's interesting how Ichi's character is reflected in both those two Yakuza characters.
Yeah, I think that whole dichotomy with Ichi being, this brutal, horrible murderer who gets off on other people's pain and being this sad sack is almost like predictive of like incel culture in a lot of ways, where he's like, "Hey, I'm just this nice guy," and whenever he does something horrible, he's just like, "I'm sorry," like there's that scene in the end where he's just like on the ground crying. He just murdered this kid's dad in front of him. And he's just like, I'm sorry," and I think that is really representative of what we see a lot from people today, where they have these big, they do something horrible and they're like, well, I feel bad about it, and it's like the thing they do is unforgivable, and it's like, well, I was listening to like we talked about in your other podcast, Ed Zwick's book, and he talks about his encounters with Harvey Weinstein and how Harvey would, he's like, obviously he did much more worse things to me, but how he had gotten screwed over kind of by him with this movie deal, and he had these big crocodile tears, as he put it. He's like, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I'm sorry." And you just had to see these people who have a lot of power doing all these really awful things, and then being like, "Well, I did this bad thing, but I'm so sorry, and forgive me." And then they just keep going back and doing the things again. Like Ichi feels bad about what he's done, but he never makes any moves to not stop doing those things in the future because he is happy, he is fulfilled in that moment doing something awful, feels bad about it, but just keeps going back and doing the awful thing again and again and gets worse and worse and worse.
That's an interesting observation. And it's funny, this happens like literally the day after I just got a very similar email from someone who had fucked me over and
Mm,
also doing the same kind of like insincere crocodile tears type apology where they try to make it all about them. It's like, oh, it was, I'm sorry, but trying to like pseudo justify
yeah,
themselves.
yeah.
And so it's very funny that this is coming right on the heels of that. Um yeah, and I think that's interesting too, because there is this there is this kind of insincerity in Ichi too when he does those things. And it's kind of funny that it is this little kid who ultimately is the one who is taking him to task for that.
Mm,
And it kind of it I because I feel like in a lot of ways Ichi himself is behaving like a little kid in that way.
yeah, yeah.
So,
He's
he's
very
this
mature.
he's this like Gigi says, it reminds me too of the whole myth around the Columbine shooters, right? So if you remember
Mm,
back in the day, for anyone who doesn't remember this, one of the narratives going around at the time was that the Columbine shooters were bullied, right? They were victims of
right.
bullying and all that, and then this was kind of like they just snapped as a result of that. And then over time, people actually realized, well, no, they were actually bullies themselves. They were not actually being bullied. And there's something about that in this movie too, because, you know, Ichi has all these memories of being bullied as a kid and all that. But Gigi confesses to Karen, he's like, he was never bullied. I put those memories in his head. So that's also another aspect of it too, I think is interesting. Whereas he is basically he's this bully who is trying to justify his actions.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. And I love that wrinkle where you find out about halfway through the movie that no, like this whole sad backstory is just nonsense and invented, and he's just being manipulated in this way to, and feeling justified in taking out these quote unquote bullies when he was never bullied at all. This whole this traumatic event that happened to him in the past is a complete fabrication, and it's just a way for him and his control for Gigi to like justify these horrible things that he's doing. It's like, well, it's okay that I'm doing this because they were bullies, or they looked like, oh, this guy looked like my bully. And yeah, it very much plays into that those same tropes that, where you were talking about that exist in real life. And to circle back to the kid, I think, the kid like kind of taking him to task and then kicking him and stuff like that. I think one of the moment that is the most shocking, the most horrific to me is when we don't even see what Ichi does to the kid, but we just turn back and he's dead and his head is off. You don't see the violence take place.
Well, something
And
about that, because
yeah.
that doesn't happen, is an important fact to remember. Because while the kid is kicking Ichi, Kakihara he's all depressed, right?
Hmm.
And he sits down, he puts the needles in both his ears,
Hmm.
and then he stops hearing anything, and then we see Ichi we stands over Takeshi's body. He does the cut thing on Kakihara's head. Kakihara jumps up on the thing and he falls down. But when Gigi finds Kakihara's body, there's no scar. There's no
Right.
wound there. And then at the end there, we see it was actually Takeshi who got revenge on Gigi. You see Gigi hanging from a tree, and you see that older guy, that young man who's looking back at his body. That's an older Takeshi who'd come back and he'd gotten revenge on Gigi.
Okay, because I was all right. That's because I was actually not sure how to interpret a lot of that stuff when you see that there's not the scar. I thought Gigi had maybe committed suicide. I didn't pick up that was an older version of him, so that's interesting. But I still think it is one of the tougher scenes to watch, even though we find out isn't not real, is when you just see the headless body of the kid. You see his head rolling on the ground. And I wonder how, because you've been shown all this very visceral violence the whole time, you're almost desensitized to it, and then you see this kid beheaded, and that is just it's so you don't it's almost worse that you don't see it because you don't expect it, you don't know that it's coming. He's just sitting there crying, and then you just cut back and it just takes the air out of your lungs. And I wonder if that was intentional, him being like violence, 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 violence. Then the worst thing that could possibly happen, a dead kid is shown and he doesn't show it, and is I don't think that's him necessarily showing restraint. I think that's him being like, we're gonna get the audience really good here, because it's almost like the thing in Jaws where every time you hear the music, the shark is coming, and the one time you don't hear the music and the shark shows up, it's even more terrifying. When you don't see the violence, you just see the after effects of the violence, it almost hits you so much harder.
That could be it too. The way I read that is, and both things could be true, right? It is
Hmm.
possible that both these things are intentional. But the way I read that was it was Kakihara wanting Ichi to be like the most violent version he could be.
Hmm.
So how would this guy that you've been hoping to be your equal, right? Because he wants that challenge, he wants that excitement of facing this guy. And like he's saying there is he's watching, Ichi like on the ground crying, and then and this little kid kicking the shit out of him. And Kakihara's just like, what's going on? We're supposed to have our big epic battle. What you're supposed to this is not how it's supposed to work. And he's just so
Yeah.
disappointed and let down by it. And so when he inserts the needles into his head and he starts hallucinating this version of Ichi, he's hallucinating his like ideal version of Ichi, this guy who's going to kill him in this epic battle and give him this big epic send-off that he wants. And ultimately the only thing he can do is just kill himself. He ends up that delusion is what finally allows him to jump off and to take his own life. Um, but yeah, both of those things could absolutely be true though.
Yeah, and that's interesting you bring up the hallucination because, like I said, I was not exactly sure how to read that when he saw that there was no scar, but that makes a lot of sense. But I was also wondering, just like, oh, he poked himself in the ears. Um, why are there no effects of that? And I'm like, well, he also had done that earlier. You mentioned the tongue cutting off scene where he cuts off his tongue and then he's just fine. Like later on, he just says that, throwaway line about the body regenerating. So I wasn't really sure how to take that, if that was an intentional setup or not.
Well, there's a degree of hyper reality in a lot of
Mhm.
Miike's films, and
Yeah.
sometimes it's to an extreme degree, like if you watch something like Gozu. But other times it is, it's just like kind of like maybe one step off of reality. So, for example, in Audition, there's this drug that she uses on him before she starts torturing him. And she tells him, right, this drug will paralyze your body, but you can still feel things, which isn't how that
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
works.
yeah, yeah.
And Miike himself, he admitted on either like a commentary track or an interview or something, I can't remember one, but he said we just invented that because we just needed a reason to
Yeah.
explain how this tiny little woman can restrain this guy who's like 3 times her size and not fight back as she's cutting his foot off.
So, yeah, that makes sense. I think that I bumped against that because, like you say, it's like one step off from reality, and I would prefer either it be like much closer to reality, or to have it be going the distance, being like, yeah, we are in a very fantastical world. Like Ace Attorney, when he directs that movie just looks like the video game. That like their hair is big, it looks ridiculous. There's all these insane technologies and screens, or you know, to talk about the effects in this and how, yeah, they are supposed to be a little bit cheesy, I think. Another Japanese film that I think does that really well and gets you into this false reality is Hausu, right? That is a movie where it's just ridiculous, insane things are happening, very cheesy, bad effects, and because that's a movie that comes out in the 70s, and they're just leaning into that low budgetness of it. This one, because it was kind of a half measure, I don't think it worked as well for me. And that's not to say that that's not something that would work at all, but I would have just preferred, like, if we are in a hyper reality, then we are in a hyper reality, or if we're going to do something more grounded, like The Departed or Heat or something like that, where it's mostly set in the world that we understand, then go for that. But it just felt lukewarm in that way to me.
Yeah, I felt like the hyper reality it works for me because of the cartoonish level of the violence and some stuff. Like for example, that first scene when we were seeing like not the first scene, but one of the opening scenes where we're seeing the aftermath of Ichi's carnage, and it's just like there's gore everywhere. The guy even slips and falls into it. We see the logo coming out of semen and all that stuff. So I feel
Right.
like those types of things are just like these really extreme examples are ways of showing us that we are in this kind of like hyper reality world for me at least.
Yeah, and I think that was just it was one step for me when I would have preferred three or four steps.
I think in later movies Ichi not Ichi Miike does do that because I feel like if you watch like Gozu or something like that, it is the degree of hyper reality is more obvious, and I feel like this is partly Miike still just kind of like finding his footing around those types of
Mm,
movies. Because a big part of it too is I think we have to consider the era in his career that he was in. He wasn't at the point he is now where he can pretty much do whatever he wants. At,
mhm.
at this point in his career, he's just starting to break into bigger films. Like up until this point, for the most part, he had just been doing, direct to video stuff. And and while he did have like hyper reality aspects on it, this is something where now he's playing with the bigger budget. He's got some bigger actors involved in it. Um, so I think there might be kind of a degree of still trying to figure out how he's going to be able to convey some of this stuff.
Yeah, that's fair. It does because Ace Attorney's 10 years after this. That does feel like he is really getting a lot more comfortable with doing the weird outside. And there was even bits from this that I recognized in that movie. Like there's a part where somebody sits down and everybody kind of like stands up quickly, like or he's pulling something out of his jacket and everyone stands up quickly in unison, and that was a beat that recurred 3 or 4 times in Ace Attorney. So yeah, I do think it is an important stepping stone for what we would get from him. That makes a lot of sense to me. Talking about this being like an early milestone for him. I was curious what your thoughts are in this being something that maybe opens up, international cinema a little bit to people because obviously, movies had been there was like critically acclaimed movies that had been, heralded in the US for a long time, but this is when like DVDs like are starting to become a real thing and we're starting to have a lot more accessibility to these movies in the US that we might not have been able to get to see without like tape trading and stuff like that before.
Well, before we get into that, we're gonna go take an ad break, or we'll take a break. Maybe you'll hear some ads, and then we'll come back, and then I'll answer your question.
You tell yourself, no one wants your college era band tees. But on Depop, people are searching for exactly what you've got. You once paid a small fortune for them at merch stands. Now, a teenager who calls them vintage will offer that same small fortune back. Sell them easily on Depop. Just snap a few photos and we'll take care of the rest. Who knew your questionable music taste would be a money-making machine? Your style can make you cash. Start selling on Depop, where taste recognizes taste.
And we're back. And to answer your question about how this movie had an impact on international cinema, I'm not so sure if I think this movie is just more, it's just a part of thing that you're getting at the time, because I really think it comes down to the success of The Ring is really kind of what did it.
Yeah.
Because the success of the American remake of The Ring that really kind of showed DVD distributors that there might be a market for Japanese horror in the US. And so then they started doing stuff like they started releasing stuff like the Japanese version of The Ring. They started releasing Audition. And they start doing the stuff kind of like to test the waters a little bit. And I'm not sure exactly. So this movie came out in 2001. I'm not sure exactly when it first came out on DVD in the States. My guess is it was probably not before 2004 or 2003, maybe was probably the earliest that it might have come out in. I can't even remember when I know I was in university when I saw it. So it was sometime between, and it was after I'd seen Audition fairly early on. I saw that in 2002. I know that because that was my first year in university. And I know I saw Gozu in 2003 because that was a year after when I transferred schools. So I knew that. And I think this had to have come out. This had to have come on my radar probably about 2004. So maybe the first DVD release was around 2003-ish or so, I believe. So yeah, probably 2004, 2005 is when I first saw this film. And by that point, I think distributors were starting to get a little bit more comfortable testing the waters. There's also a big, kind of like secondary DVD market, or also like import DVD market with things like Hong Kong releases, which often would have English subtitles on them, and were often Region Zero releases. So there was a lot of those that were floating around the market at the time.
Yeah, because I'm looking at Letterboxd and I'm seeing it doesn't show a physical release date for the DVD, but I do see it was theatrically released in the US in May of 2003.
Okay, that sounds about right. In fact, one of the things, and I read this in the trivia, as part of the promotion of that, they gave attendees barf bags.
Right. That was at like during the fest because I know this was at TIFF, so I think that might have been where they were giving those out.
Okay. And one of the things too I remember is because I remember I've had two different versions of this on DVD. One was really just kind of like a bare bone disc set, which was just like a single disc, I think, and not very good quality. And there was a second disc set that came out a few years after that, and I think that was probably around 2004, 2005, and that had like even like a gimmick thing where it came with like a blood bag in
Oh,
it,
okay, okay.
which I didn't keep because I never keep the cases anymore. But even that, like, it was just, but it was like this. It was a weird thing to include with the DVD because if that thing breaks in your collection, then you're screwed.
Right, right. Yeah, and
Um,
then there's also the 2018. I think there's like a restoration that they do
yeah,
too.
that's like the definitive. I think there's like a definitive restoration of it in
Mhm.
that, which I haven't seen that. Like this is still like the second DVD I own that is the version I watched here. So it's still
Okay,
not
because
this quality.
yeah.
It's better than the one I originally had, but it's still not. It's still just basic,
Mhm.
import DVD style thing.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, because I know I did. The one I watched was the same one from the restoration because I watched it on streaming and it was just it starts with this block of text that says this film originally came out, blah blah blah, and it since and there was a lot of scenes that were taken out. Those scenes have been put back in. This is the restored version, like it's the same version that came on the 4K. Like the thing that like it's not Criterion, but like Criterion does a lot of time where you'll start a movie and it'll say this version has been restored to its whatever it was originally shot on 16 millimeter. It blew up to 32, whatever it might be. Give all the technical aspects like that.
Now some other interesting things is because this there are like two halves of this movie, and in the first half, like we had talked about, there's a lot of focus on the sexual violence, the violence towards women, and all that, which makes it very difficult to watch. One of the things I started to realize too in this recent viewing is after the confrontation with Karen, when he kills Karen, there's almost the violence almost completely shifts to being very male centric from that point on. So there's almost like this transition into being a focus much more on like male on male violence. There's a lot less male on female violence. And I really feel like there's something to be said about that, going along with the whole incel thing you mentioned too. Because one of the things that strikes me about the incel culture and all that is just how at one side it like the misogyny is is a big part of it too, but it's also kind of it's also just like a kind of a projection of just like the
Hmm.
self-hatred that they have for themselves too.
Yeah, yeah,
And I
absolutely.
feel like this movie is kind of reflecting that as well. Like you have these very violent characters who, bring out all this violence against women, and then they end up inflicting that violence on each other. And so like so there's something to be said about that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely see that. There's a lot of because we talked about there's a lot of sexual violence being done towards women. There's also a lot of just like really just absolutely horrific and brutal violence being done from men to other men. And I don't even necessarily think that starts after the character because that's I think a through line of the film. There's that whole torture scene that happens where they are like pouring the tempura over the guy and like cutting pieces of him off and like it's just and you mentioned the tongue scene, of course, that's self-harm that he's doing. There is a lot of just gratuitous almost violence being portrayed throughout the entire film.
Now, I could be wrong here, but as I'm saying this, and I was trying to think back, I don't recall Kakihara ever committing any violence against women.
I because there's the person who she gets her nipples cut off, but and he's
Right,
there,
but
but
that's
I
not
don't think
him. He's
he's
not
yeah.
present
I was supposed
there.
to say I don't
Yeah.
think that's him. He's just around. Those
But
are
he's
those
not even
two.
there when that happens. He only comes in
Yeah,
the aftermath of it,
that's
too.
true. That's an interesting point. What do you think? Do you think
So
that,
I think this
that's
is
anything? Yeah, what's he saying with that?
well, I think there's a definite homoerotic subtext to here. And calling it subtext might be too generous. I think it's very
Yeah.
text. I think it's very obvious.
Hmm.
Um, I mean, and well, also too the fact that Kakihara is depicted the way he is, right? With
Hmm.
like the style of clothes he wears, and all that kind of stuff. It's very, especially like early 2000s, like gay coded type of thing, right? Like
Right.
the kind of like bright, flashy colors and all that kind of stuff. Especially because in the comic, the manga, Kakihara was not like this at all. He was kind of like an overweight, like standard Yakuza guy.
Hmm.
So I mean, he still had the piercings and the scars, but the kind of like the flashy clothes and all that, the kind of like the sense of style he has all of that is just invented for the movie. And I feel like that's something that Miike is playing with here, this kind of homoerotic subtext, which he does a lot in a lot of the Yakuza movies. Like there's a lot of this we talked about in Gozu as well. Um, And my guess at the time, and again, I'm not sure if this is true. I haven't been able to find any corroboration on that. Had said that he had heard somewhere that Miike had come out recently as LGBTQ. I haven't been able to find a source for that myself, so I don't know if it's true or not. But it's an interesting aspect to it, especially when you look back at these other films, and I really feel like he is playing with that homoerotic subtext in here. And I think especially with Kakihara, because the fact that all these other male characters are they're definitely straight and their own, but they commit violence against, they externalize their self-hatred and violence against women, whereas Kakihara externalizes that only on other men.
Yeah, I think you're onto something there with the portrayal of him being, very, very queer coded. Obviously there's that whole thing, well, him being how much he's like misses his boss because the boss is really the only one who can, who gets that rise out of him. And it's implied to be a very sexual rise when he was like being beaten by him. And then you juxtapose that with, Karen, and he's like, all right, Karen's like, I'll be your girl. And he's like, okay, cool. And she's beating him and he's just like, yeah, this is not doing it for me. Like this violence that you're inflicting upon me, it's not the same as when the guy was doing it. And he looks forward so much to that showdown with Ichi throughout the whole movie. And then there's also like smaller stuff too, like, getting somebody's entire fist in his mouth. There's definitely, I would say, not even subtle hints. It's very much implying like, yeah, this is a character who is gay, and I mean, I'm not sure what exactly he's trying to say with that, but other than maybe, there's a lot of, in these kind of very masculine organizations, whether they be, criminals or politicians or whatever, these people who are often, violent people, they are often closeted people. You always hear about like Grinder crashing at Republican conventions and stuff like that. So I think that maybe that's a little bit what he's hinting at there.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, another thing I wanted to talk, there are two other points that I wanted to mention here. And the first thing is Karen in general, and she's played by Paulin Sun, who is actually Hong Kong Singaporean. And in this, she's a Zainichi Chinese prostitute in this. So I thought that was an interesting aspect of it. The fact that they bring in her to this actress to play this, and the fact that she's often alternating between three languages, right? I didn't really realize this, probably because my Japanese wasn't that, I had no Japanese ability the first time I saw this movie, but watching it again, I was very struck at how she switches not only between English and Japanese, but also Chinese. And like in many
Yeah.
scenes when she's talking to Gigi, she's speaking to him only in Chinese. She's not talking to him in English or in Japanese. Um, I thought that was a interesting aspect of it too. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I thought that was it's something where I was like, okay, there's clearly some stuff here about like inter-Asian cultures, where you have Ichi, as they mentioned that he's Chinese. There's all the stuff about like, oh, there's the Chinese pimp, and then so then of course with her speaking English, I think that her from being mentioned as being someone from Hong Kong. Hong Kong is almost seen as, I feel like, kind of a crossroads with a lot of like between Eastern and Western cultures, and how she's code switching between Japanese, Chinese, and English. How Hong Kong is kind of like half China, half English because it was ruled by the British for so many years, and then also it's of course close to Japan. I think I'm not informed enough about the different cultures within Asia to say what it's saying, but it was clear that it was hinting at something, with, between Japanese, Hong Kong, Chinese immigration, and, just the cultures colliding, maybe even being influenced by Western cultures, because you have the English being spoken as well. I would love to hear what you, being a little more informed about that, thinks about those things.
I mean, I'm not sure if I don't think I've quite articulated a thesis on it, but one of the interesting things too about it is Tadanobu Asano as well is, what we call half in Japan, or at least a little bit. He's one quarter of European ancestry, right?
Mhm.
His grandfather was the U.S. citizen who of Scandinavian descent. Um, so there's the fact that you get there's that aspect of it too. We have Karen here as well. Um, you have Ryu, one of the character who's part of Gigi's cleaning crew, right? He's Zainichi Chinese as well. So, and in a lot of Miike's Yakuza movies, he will often play with uh these characters who are not purely of Japanese descent. He'll often make a point of mentioning at some point the fact that they are Korean or Chinese, and that's an often overlooked side of the Yakuza, which again, it's an interesting dichotomy with the Yakuza, because the Yakuza are also very heavily involved in right-wing nationalist politics,
Mm.
um, which is very isolationist, very xenophobic. But one of the things you often see, especially like among the rank and file Yakuza, is there are a lot of, at least of Asian descent, immigrants or just people who are of non-Japanese Asian descent as well mixed in there. And one of the reason why, one of the reasons why is because the Yakuza intentionally target for recruiting people who are kind of like on the outside of society. So,
Okay.
and so I think that's interesting, the fact that you have this dichotomy between the Yakuza's support for these right-wing xenophobic politics, which are very ostensibly against the interests of many of their rank and file members. And not only in the terms of just the regular Yakuza members too, but also other people they deal with, right? So like, you know, lots of women who are working in the night trade business, lots of people who are working in the drug business for them. There are these people that their businesses depend on, who are very much impacted by the policies they are politically supporting, which in a lot of ways it's very similar to, you can also look at it as in the US context, the Republicans being a very xenophobic anti-immigrant party, but at the same time, they support businesses that profit off of exploitation of immigrants.
Yeah, that's interesting knowing that context and the way, they operate it with those different, ethnic groups. Because yeah, that is something I would not have known about. And that's why I think, I'm a fan of podcasts like this that give insights into, Japanese film that you might not have otherwise, honestly.
And then along that line too, we have Gigi. And the more I think about it, and Gigi's role in all this, right? So he's a former cop himself, it's implied, and or I think
Mhm.
maybe outright stated at some point. And but he's going outside the law. He's using Ichi to, wage war on the Yakuza. And but he's doing it through manipulation of Gigi's memories. And one of the things that struck me as interesting about that was, I was thinking about it, and I don't know if this is intentional. This could just be my reading of it, but one of the readings I'm kind of looking at it with that is that you have this situation where you have this older guy in a position of authority, right? Or someone who's a symbol of, law and order in Japan, who is going outside the law and manipulating the memories of this young guy to kind of do his bidding. And it kind of struck me as like the kind of, because Japan has been ruled almost continuously since the end of the occupation by the right-wing Liberal Democratic Party, which is neither liberal nor democratic, is the joke. Um, and one of the things that's been big, and especially a big faction, the current faction that's in control, in fact, of the LDP, is revisionist history, especially
Mhm.
revisionist history of Japan's role in World War II, because the party was founded by a fascist, right? Shinzo Abe's grandfather, Nobusuke Kishi, was an outright fascist. He was a brutal governor of Manchuria, and he was a Class C war criminal, Class C or Class B, I can't remember. I think it was Class C war criminal who was released from prison by the CIA because they were worried that the burgeoning Japanese government was becoming too left wing. So they made deals with all the Class B and Class C war criminals, had them move in and kind of form a counterbalance to it. And the CIA also bankrolled the LDP for, or supported them for many, many years. Plus, also they had supported the Yakuza as well. So I feel like Gigi could kind of be viewed as kind of a symbol of that aspect of it, trying to manipulate the memories of the young, trying to whitewash or, show them the version of the past they want them so that they can be most effective to get their interests. So that was kind of thing I was thinking about as I was rewatching it last night.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think the way that they are showing these institutions that have a lot of power in this film, whether it be the cops that are very corrupt in it or, the gangsters, Gigi, these people that have influence over these other groups, whether they be immigrants or, ethnic minorities or women or whatever it might be, the way that they are just clearly manipulating them, don't care about them at all. And you have the one person in the film who I think is legitimately someone who is a good person that you can kind of root for in Kaneko, who was a cop at one point, but he lost that job because he lost his gun. But I think it's also kind of implied that he was maybe too compassionate for that role, and he shows some compassion to Ichi. It's reflective of the compassion that he was shown by his father because he has no reason to do that other than he sees someone in distress, someone who might not be native in this country, and he wants to help him. Whereas everyone else is just seeking to manipulate all these. He's like a low level guy. He's just a hitman. He gets kind of talked down to every time he has an idea or tries to do something by these people who have the power, who are just seeking to use these people as just a means to an end, abusing them and just, you know, for their own selfish means.
Yeah, and I think there's also something to that with Kaneko too, because even like the outfit he wears, right? He's wearing like this like leather suit and all that. He looks very uncomfortable in it,
Hmm.
right? Like the entire movie, he looks completely out of place. And I think the actor Sabu does a really good job of portraying that aspect of him, and the fact that the implication that he might be too soft for the kind of work that needs to be
Mm.
done, either as a cop or as a yakuza. Plus, the fact that he goes from cop to yakuza too also kind of shows the connection between
Right.
those two industries there, right? The fact that he could easily go from being a cop to then being a yakuza, or the fact that Gigi is a cop, but he's involved in taking out the yakuza through extra legal means. You also have Jiro and Saburo, who are also corrupt detectives as well. So there's a lot of this back and forth, and a lot of these actors who play these kind of yakuza in a lot of these movies, you'll see them in other movies where they're playing cops, and it's like and there's
Yeah,
like no
yeah.
change in their performance. So there's definitely something there as well. I think this kind of corruption of power, that there were this corruption in the power structure there.
Yeah, it's almost very Scorsese, and it's like, I always think of that line that parted is like, you can be when we were kids, we could be cops or criminals, and when you're facing a loaded gun, what's the difference? And it's just that whole movie is about these criminals that are pretending to be cops and cops that are pretending to be criminals, and how really it's just the same thing. It's just two sides of the coin, and I think that's present here, and how other than the one guy, everyone, regardless of what they're doing, just takes so much enjoyment with inflicting pain on others. Like that's, I think, the one real major recurring theme in this is just like these people love to cause pain, whether it's they get off on it, or they just, I think it's fun, or they think it's funny, or like, because the whole torture scene with the at the beginning of the movie is because he thinks he might have something to do with his boss's disappearance. And, so he's pours boiling hot oil on him. He's carving him up. He's doing all these, like he's hanging him from hooks. And it's because he thinks maybe he'll do it. And it seems like almost like, well, if I'm wrong, then whatever, I can cut my own tongue out, inflict more pain. And if I'm right, I get to, find my boss. But either way, he wins because he's getting to hurt someone.
Yeah, absolutely. And also too, there's the ending where we see the older Takeshi getting his revenge on Gigi. So that's something else too, this idea of like the cycle of violence is continuing here, right? So
Mhm.
it like there's no real resolution of that aspect of it. We still see that violence continuing, and we don't know what's going to happen to Takeshi after this too. But there's kind of an implication with the fact that he is there with a group of children there as well. It also kind
Yeah.
of implies too that he's going to kind of this is going to be continuing in some form.
Right, because he was the one pure innocent. Like he was just like a kid, and he saw this horrific thing happen to his dad, and then he joins the cycle of violence. His dad, who was the one noble person, now he can't even and he wants his son to kind of like live a better life than all this. He wants to protect him and all that. He ultimately can't even do that.
Yeah, yeah. Were there any other points you wanted to mention about Ichi the Killer?
No, I think we hit on it. Like I said, well-made movie. I think there was a lot of interesting stuff to talk about, but ultimately, just I think just too nihilistic for me to want to recommend to anyone.
I will say it's it is a difficult watch, and especially it and like I said, my opinion of it has definitely cooled over time, but I still think there's some stuff that it's trying to say, and I feel like it is effective in that aspect of it, and in when trying to make the viewer kind of confront their own attitudes towards violence in media. So I thought that aspect of it is very interesting, especially because if you compare this to other stuff that was this is also I think also the context of the time is interesting as well, because this is the I mean it came out in 2001. I mean it wasn't made in a post 9/11 era, but it was released in a post 9/11 era.
Hmm.
And you had this, but you also had at the same time you had Kill Bill, you had stuff like Hostel, you had this kind of the rise of the Saw movies, the kind of rise of the torture porn subgenre of horror and all that. And even though this was in a Japanese context and not an American context, I really think there's an interesting thing that was happening in the world at that time where we're starting to become more comfortable with these kind of displays of extreme violence that we really didn't see in a lot of movies, not really since the 70s, right? And most of the time then, it tended to be relegated the more extreme forms, stuff like Cannibal Holocaust, something like that. Um, it was more relegated to like B or C level movies. It wasn't like the A-list movies. Whereas in the 2000s, we're seeing it in the A-list movies more or less.
Yeah, and I think it is kind of the ultimate, like the rise of these movies, like you said, the Saw movies, all the Hostels, all this those kind of style came about as like you didn't really see like stuff on live TV that was just like horrific and would mess you up um, regularly until like the 90s and then into the 2000 2001, like me and my other friends in middle school all watched 9/11 happen on live TV, whereas start in the 70s was when you first started to see war footage on the news, but a lot of times that wasn't even live. That was the start of it, and it kind of I think just built into you know uh, I guess this movement, and I think that we've maybe gone away from that a little bit. There has been like a little bit of a step back from that hyper violence. But yeah, it definitely had its moment there for a second.
Yeah. It's just well, also too, I think also it's interesting to look at it in the context of, like you mentioned, Vietnam War back in the 70s, Iraq War in the early 2000s. And I really think there's something, I don't know, maybe it's kind of like an audience form of catharsis in a way
Mm.
to, but I don't know. But there's something there to it. I think it can't be overlooked. And I'm not really quite sure how to kind of square that circle there, but I think there is something there about what was happening in the zeitgeist, both in the States but also internationally. I think that's kind of why this movie found so much success in the States at the time when it did come out.
Mm.
Whereas if it came out now, I don't think it would have had the same kind of success like on, streaming or anything like that it had on back on the DVD market at the time.
Yeah, no, that I would agree with that. That 100%, that makes sense.
And it is interesting because the release date, I just looked this up, it was September 14th, 2001. So it was just a few days
Oh
after
wow.
9/11 that debuted at TIFF.
Okay, wow. Huh, well, that's something.
Okay. So that about does it for the discussion of Ichi the Killer. So Derek, why don't you tell people where they can find you?
Yeah, if you go to underratedmoviepodcast.com, you can find links to my podcast, or Underrated Movie Podcast, on all of the social media. You can also find my writing by going to like watchmojo.com. I write a lot of video top tens and essays and stuff for them. But yeah, underratedmoviepodcast.com is going to be the main hub.
Okay. And as for us, japanonfilm.com is the website. We are japanonfilm.com on Blue Sky, Japan on Film on any other socials that you use. And we are also part of the Film Stories Podcast Network. So you can find out more about them going to filmstories.co.uk, or you can also just look up and see what else is coming up on the network, listen to the ads. And also, we do have a Discord. You can find the link to that in the show notes. And the Discord we got a channel specifically for Japan on Film, but also there are channels for all the other podcasts on the network. So please check those things out. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.
The Japan on Film podcast is produced by me, Perry Constantine, in conjunction with the Film Stories Podcast Network. Visit japanonfilm.com for show notes, episodes, and information about being a guest yourself. You can also reach out to me on the website's contact form if you have questions or comments about Japanese movies or the show itself. The show is at Japan on Film on Threads, Blue Sky, and Instagram, so please be sure to follow us. If you'd like to support the show, you can donate on japanonfilm.com, purchase from our advertisers, or leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Join the Film Stories Podcast Network Discord from the link in the show notes to connect with me and many other cinema fans and podcasters.